Hello and welcome to a video lecture that I've put together for you on citing your research using MLA Citation Style. MLA stands for Modern Language Association, which is an organization that is primarily in the humanities. It is an international organization, and the other major citation style that you might be using is APA style, which is American Psychological Association. And depending on your major, you can use MLA or APA style. Just be consistent in your use of your citation style. Unfortunately, I guess for some of you who use APA style, all I'm going to talk about today is MLA style. So let me go over some basics of using MLA style. Okay, first of all, before we get into using MLA style, I had a few questions for you. The first one is, why do we cite? So you're probably thinking of several reasons why we cite. The one that people mention most often is to avoid plagiarism. So what is plagiarism? Plagiarism is representing someone else's ideas as your own. The word plagiarism actually comes from a Latin word that means kidnapping, and so we're basically kidnapping someone else's ideas, taking their name off of it and putting our name on it. The most obvious form of plagiarism, I think, is to lift information directly out of one of your sources and put it in your paper as if it were your own writing without citing it parenthetically. And we'll talk about what parenthetical citation is in a second. But there are other forms of plagiarism as well. So downloading a paper off the internet and turning it in as your work is another form of plagiarism. And that's one of the reasons that I have you guys go through the various stages of the writing process. If I see your work developing from topic to discovery draft to rough draft and possible intermediate draft and then final draft, I'm pretty confident that you have not plagiarized any wholesale in terms of the entire paper. But there still could be some of that plagiarism where you've taken something from a source and stuck it in your paper without citing it properly. Another form of plagiarism is, let's say you had a roommate or something who took this class last semester or a year ago or something, and they got an A on their paper. And so this time you didn't download off the internet, you borrowed someone else's paper, took their name off, and turned it in as your own. Again, that is plagiarism, and despite how easy it is to download papers off the internet, pay for them, and turn them in as your own, I actually see that last form, borrowing someone's paper and turning it in as your own, I see that more frequently than people downloading papers off the internet. So I also try to avoid plagiarism by making sure that you, as I said, work through the various stages of the writing process, and I prohibit you from changing your topic at the last minute and turning in a final draft when I have not seen it go through the various stages. So occasionally students do want to change their topic at the last minute. That's fine with me, but you have to go back and recreate all those stages of the writing process in order to do so. So too often I've seen people struggle with a paper, and then the night before something's due, and then they come in the day that something's due, and suddenly they've had this epiphany overnight about what they really wanted to write about, and they turn in this pristine paper, and I'm thinking, this just simply does not look like the student's work. So, and I usually quiz them over it to find out, and if they can't answer questions about their own paper, then it's probably been plagiarized. So really there's no purpose to plagiarize. Especially the more you familiarize yourself with the writing process, give yourself license that first time through to be a bad writer, just to get ideas out, get them down on paper. I tell myself sometimes when I face that writer's block, and writer's block is usually the result of expecting so much out of your writing. You want to get it right the first time, but give yourself license to be a really bad writer. And I say, this is going to be the worst stuff I've ever written. And maybe I write it sloppily on paper first until I get something going, and then I get to the computer and try to clean it up. Or I might just write on the computer and try to turn off my internal editor in order to get into the flow of things. And then the hardest thing is to get that first draft down. Once you get that first draft down, it's only going to get better from there. So, but definitely we cite in order to avoid plagiarism. Usually kind of hand in hand with that, students will tell me that another reason why we cite is to give credit where credit is due. This kind of implies that ideas belong to different people, and there's a certain originality of ideas. And in academia, that has been debated somewhat. That I think that with Rene Descartes in the Middle Ages saying that I think, therefore I am, in Western thought, we tend to associate ideas as being original and belonging to particular people. And but that's been challenged over the past 100 years or so. A woman by the name of Karen Burke Lefevre wrote a book called Invention as a Social Act, in which she documented how many of the great ideas in history have been the result of collaboration. And in terms of geniuses, that there's a phenomenon called clustering, that geniuses tend to occur in clusters historically, and so they're kind of feeding off each other's ideas. So some people have said before, I can see as far as I can see because I stand on the shoulder of giants, saying that maybe they're not original, that they have, through the timeline of history, that they've borrowed ideas from other people. So originality is somewhat questionable, but certainly I think that the intent is good, to give credit where credit is due. And the third reason that I see most often is reproducibility. So what do we mean by that? That if someone took your paper, they should be able to reproduce your research using an MLA style, a system of in-text parenthetical citations, and then an end-of-text works cited list. We should be able to go to the library or somehow and lay our hands on those same sources and reproduce your research. This kind of is seen pretty obviously, I think, in the sciences and social sciences, where people will, in journal articles, oftentimes you'll see that they have set up their research, their experiment, their methodology. They talk about how they put their entire study together. And then usually it's like in the last fourth of the journal article that we see results and conclusions and implications for further research. So the really juicy parts for most of us in the humanities is at the end of those scientific or social science journal articles. But we have all that stuff before, so that if someone said, I found a cure for cancer, and published it as a journal article, other people should be able to go back and reproduce their experiments looking at their journal article and decide whether, yes, they have found a cure for cancer, or no, they have not. So reproducibility is important, whether we're in the sciences or the social sciences or the humanities. So, and in that spirit, we try to provide enough information so that they can successfully, from our text, find the source that we're talking about in our end of text works cited list, and that we provide enough information in the end of text works cited list that they can go find that source somewhere else in the library or online or whatever. So keeping that in mind, I think, helps you in terms of developing your citations, that how can I make this so that the text connects with the works cited list, and that the works cited list connects with the original source. So keep those ideas in mind. Okay, so the next question is, when do you cite? So the most often instance when we cite is a direct quote. So we've taken material directly from a source and we surround it with quotation marks, and so after the quote then we put an in-text parenthetical citation that leads us to the works cited list. So obviously, direct quote, we need to cite that. What about paraphrased information? Yes, we need to cite that too. In fact, I encourage you to paraphrase information when possible. When I was an undergrad, I was a journalism major, and in terms of direct quotes, my journalism chair used to always say, only quote if it's quotable, if it's said in an original way. But as often as possible, paraphrase what someone says. So don't get in the habit of quoting everything directly in your paper. Try to paraphrase when you can, and if you just can't, then you want to put it in a direct quote, then great. But, okay. Information that you did not know before. So I think you found something out through your research, and you want to attribute and cite that information. I'm going to talk in another lecture about working with sources and talk about attribution and citation, using those together. But obviously, information that you did not know before you conducted your research, you need to cite that. Okay, original concepts and ideas. Sometimes particular ideas are tied to particular people. And I actually went through a little bit of this in my, when I was writing my dissertation, my doctoral program, that I was working with some ideas from a Brazilian educator named Paulo Freire, and Freirean pedagogy. Pedagogy is the science and study of teaching. Is used very commonly and frequently in rhetoric and composition studies, and to the extent that I was kind of using some of his terms like critical consciousness and problem posing, conscientização, as they say in Portuguese, and that I was not attributing or citing some of this information because it's used so commonly in composition studies. But I had a member of my committee who was an education faculty member, and she wanted me to be sure to attribute or cite that information anytime I used it. So, so occasionally, maybe we think that this is part of our discourse community, that we use these terms pretty freely, but certainly critical consciousness, problem posing, those are ideas that have come from Paulo Freire, and so I did try to cite those. Okay. So how do you cite? I think we're going to get to that. That's going to be the bulk of what we're talking about today. And in MLA style, we use a system of what I've already mentioned, in-text parenthetical citations that direct us to our end-of-text works cited list. So in an MLA style, the end-of-text works cited list is called a works cited list, not a bibliography. They've decided in the past 10-20 years that bibliography literally means a collection of books, and because we're using so many more things than books, articles, mixed media, websites, interviews, observations, and such, that they've decided that works cited is the more appropriate term to use. In APA style, they call it references, but we call it works cited in MLA style. Okay, so basically, one of the things to keep in mind with the works cited list is that almost every works cited entry boils down to three things: author, followed by a period, the title of the work, followed by a period, and publication information, and then there's a period at the end of the entire works cited entry. So basically 3 main parts. Sometimes the parts become a bit more involved, but if you can keep that in your head, author, title, and publication information, then I think you're going to go a long ways toward good intent in enabling the people who read your essays to also be able to access these sources in case they wanted to follow up on any of those. So, for a book, this 3-part thing breaks down, and they have it in our text under the MLA section, into author, and then the title of the book, and I probably should have italicized it right there, and then the publication information is city, colon, and then the publisher, and then a comma, and then the date. But we still have those 3 main parts, author, title, and publication information. So as an example, this is the citation information if I were putting it in a works cited list for our textbook. So in terms of author, we have multiple authors. And in the course schedule, I've been calling it Lunsford et al. We will use that Lunsford et al. In a parenthetical citation because it saves space. But in the works cited entry, we do want to cite the work fully, and so we want to include the other authors as well. The first author, and we don't alphabetize the authors, we go with who is listed first because they are first author for a reason. They've done most of the work. Or in this case, actually all of these people are big names in Rec Comp studies, but maybe this person, did the most work, is the biggest name possibly. The first author, we do last name, comma, first name. And then if we only had another author, then we, like Lisa Eade, we would do Lunsford, comma, Andrea, comma, and then and Lisa Eade. We go first name, last name with subsequent authors. But because we have more than 2 authors, we actually separate the authors with semicolons because that's kind of like a comma on steroids. It's a larger type of comma. And so we have first author, last name, first name, and then semicolon. And then the second author, semicolon, third author, fourth author, fifth author. You might notice that between Carol Clark Papper and Keith Walters that I still have a semicolon in there. Most of the time in journalistic style, we would kind of drop down before the and, we would drop down to a comma. Carol Clark Papper, comma, and Keith Walters. And if we just had a series that was separated by commas, we would actually leave off the comma after Papper and then have and Keith Walters. But we're kind of using what's called the Oxford comma, that we still put a comma in before the and. Or in this case, because we're separating everything with semicolons, we still put in a semicolon before the final item in the series. So then, I've got the title of the work. Notice that it's in italics. Frequently, students tell me that you're supposed to underline the title of a book. The reason you have probably heard that you're supposed to underline the title of a book is because historically, on typewriters, we could not represent things in italics, and so underlining meant that it should be in italics. So you may still have professors who insist on you underlining the title of a book or a journal or something large that can be, that has separate components to it, like chapters or articles within it. If your professor says underline the title of a book, go ahead and underline the title of a book. But I'm here to tell you that the reason that we've underlined them to begin with owes everything to the typewriter and the fact that you couldn't represent things in italics, and so underlining was a representation of italics. So on a computer, word processing, of course, we can represent it in italics, so I'm encouraging you to do that. Okay, then we have a period after that, and then we have the publication information, which is city, colon, and then the publisher, W.W. Norton and Company, I just shortened it to W.W. Norton, and then comma, and then the year of publication. So occasionally, when you see, let's say you're looking on the title page for the some of this information, you might see several cities listed. You might see New York, Boston, Chicago, London. You're like, do I need to mention all of those? Just mention the first city. So, okay. You might also notice that with this paragraph, the entry that I have here, that the first line kind of hangs out to the left a little bit, and then the subsequent lines are indented a little bit. This is what's known as a hanging indentation. In APA style, they actually use a traditional indentation. Indent the first line 5 spaces or 3 spaces sometimes to save space. But in MLA style, we use hanging indentations. And so I want to show you how you do this in Microsoft Word. Okay, so there's a whole lot of text here. Bear with me just a little bit. I want to kind of show it to you bit by bit. So the first part, we have our, I put works cited at the top. I triple spaced to come down here. The works cited entries are double spaced. Occasionally I see people try to single space them. And so now that I've got this in there, I just typed it in normally. And now I want to set up my hanging indentation. So I'm going to highlight this paragraph. And then I'm going to go up into Format, Paragraph. And I am on a Mac, so it looks a little bit differently than you might see on a PC. But we've got indentation and spacing up here, and then down here we've got indentation. And then right here in the middle, we see this thing that says Special. And there are only 2 special things under it. First line, which is what we normally do with paragraphs. Most of us kind of just don't even mess with this formatting here. We just hit the Tab key at the beginning of a paragraph. But you see right below it, hanging indentation. And so I'm going to click on that. And it says by 1/2 inch right here. And then I don't know if you can see it very well, but in this little preview pane down here, we get to see what it's going to look like in the document. So I'm going to click OK. And there is my hanging indentation. So you could type them all in just as normal text and then highlight all of your entries and then format them all at one time as hanging indentations. Or I could do the first one, and then once I hit enter and start doing another entry, it's going to format this next paragraph, it sees it as a paragraph, in the same manner that it formatted the previous paragraph. So it's up to you. You can type all of your sources in and then format them, or you could type in one source and format it as a hanging indentation and then hit enter at the end of that paragraph, and it will format subsequent paragraphs the same as the previous paragraph. Okay. Every now and then, actually probably more than every now and then, I'll see students type one line and then they'll actually hit enter and come down to the next line and then hit tab to move that text over. I think that can work, maybe most of the time, but if you decided that you wanted to change the size of your text or the font that you're using, or if you realize that you have to add additional information into this works cited entry, then it's going to take a whole lot more reformatting. But if you do it the other way and don't hit the enter there, if you format it as a hanging indentation to begin with, I can add as much information into it as I want. I can change the font, I can change the size of the font, and it's going to continue to be formatted as a hanging indentation. Okay, so I mentioned before that in the works cited entry we need to include all of the authors. In the parenthetical citation, because there are so many authors, we're going to use this et al., which is a Latin abbreviation for among others. And basically the parenthetical citation in MLA style is fairly minimalist. I want to take you down to this next example here, where we get rid of the extra authors, because most of the time we do not have any punctuation between the author and the page number. So most of the time we don't want a comma, and we don't want a P period either. So MLA style is kind of minimalistic. They're trying to make the citation, the parenthetical citation, as small as possible, basically, so that when you encounter it as a reader, your eye kind of just blips right over it and keeps on going. But if you kind of have a question in your mind, like, where did that come from? Then you've got the citation there, and it doesn't interrupt your reading process too much. And actually, sometimes when I'm writing, I don't want to interrupt my writing process too much. That there might be times when I'm writing and I realize I got this information from a source, and I'll kind of throw in a blank parenthetical. I might just do an opening parentheses, and then some spaces, and then a closing parentheses, and then I go on and continue. And I'll go back and I'll look at my paper later and say, what are these empty parenthetical citations doing here? And then I realize, I need to fill in the author and page number there. The reason we have the comma up here is because of this Latin abbreviation, which we don't see very often. So, and the period, again, because of the Latin abbreviation. So, to kind of genericize it, I did this one right here with Smith, page 25. And so, again, you see no comma, and you don't see the P period in here. The other thing I wanted to point out is that the parenthetical citation is part of the sentence. So occasionally people want to put a period before the citation and then have the parenthetical citation after, but you shouldn't do that. You should make the parenthetical citation part of the sentence. This does get a little confusing. I know this isn't a word here, but it gets a little confusing for some people when there is a direct quote. They want to end the direct quote with a period and then a quotation mark. But again, the citation is part of the sentence. So have your closing quotation mark and then your parenthetical citation and then in the sentence. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is down here a little bit. I just lifted a paragraph out of the syllabus. But occasionally you're citing what's called an extended quote or a block quote. In MLA style, any citation that you have, or direct quote, that is 4 lines or more, and so this is 6 lines, should be indented 5 spaces from the left. So I'm just going to go up here and hit that indentation thing up there. And it should also be double spaced. So I'm going to select this paragraph and on my spacing, make it double space. Okay. So this can be a little confusing for people at times because maybe they're used to seeing in books that they indent it both from the left and the right, and oftentimes single space it, sometimes even in a smaller font or point size. But according to MLA style, for an extended quote, we only indent it 5 spaces from the left. We keep the right margin the way it is. We do need to double space it, so maintain double spacing. Because it's indented 5 spaces from the left, we don't need a quotation mark at the beginning. It's kind of redundant. The indentation from the left indicates that it's a quote, so we don't need that there. But at the end of the extended quote, the block quote, we'll have our citation down here, and actually we do not have it as part of the sentence here because the quote is multiple sentences, and so this is an exception to making the parenthetical citation part of the sentence. We have our multiple sentences and then our period. Again, no quotation mark at the end, and then we put our citation down there. Okay, so another thing that I'm trying to show you with this paragraph here is that a quote within a quote. So I shortened it to only 3 lines so that it's not an extended quote. So imagine that this is part of a paragraph, in the middle of a paragraph, And so we open the quote with double quotes, but then we have a quote within a quote, so we have to drop down to single quotes. And then at the end, we close the single quote, close the double quote, have the parenthetical citation, and then close the sentence. So I'm sure your head is probably spinning at this point, but bear with me on this. And then what I'm trying to show you right here is where we've paraphrased some information. Paraphrase when you can. And I've seen this fairly often where people have wanted to quote something from a government agency like the U.S. Census Bureau, and I just made up this fact here. And so they want to put it in direct quotes. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, 90% of Americans have access to the internet. There's no reason to make that a direct quote. It's information, but we do need to cite it, and so I have the citation at the end. And this according to at the beginning is what we call attribution, and I'm going to talk more about that in my next video lecture. So paraphrase when you can, cite whether it's a direct quote or a paraphrase. And we're going to get to websites here in a second. I think that's all I need on that. So let me go back to my PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so we talked about a book, and we're trying to do this author, title, publication information. Now I'm going to take a part of a book, so a chapter. So, or maybe you were trying to cite one of the essays that's in our text. So again, we're trying to follow the same thing, author, title, publication information, but it does get a little more complicated. So we would have the author again, and then the title of the work. So maybe it was the title of the chapter or the title of one of the essays in our text. And then after that, the publication information gets a bit complicated. So I put in, and then I put the title of the larger work. In this case, maybe everyone's an author. And then by, and then I would list all of the authors. Even if there were 4 or 5 of them, I would list all of them. So we have the primary author at the beginning, but then we have the authors of the larger work. Or in many cases, you're looking at an edited collection, and so we might have edited by, and then the names of the editors. And then again, we have the city, the publisher, and the date. And then normally that would be the end of our publication information. We end it with a period. But then what follows after that are the page numbers, and I just made these up, 15 to 26. Notice that there aren't any, there's not a P or PP. Sometimes we use PP period for multiple pages. None of that at the end. We've kind of tried to leave some of that out to make it a bit more condensed. So again, we're following that overall principle of author, title, and publication information. But in this case, the publication information is fairly large. So another thing that you'll probably be dealing with are articles. So again, we're trying to follow the same pattern that we've used before. And let's say you found an article in a journal. So we have the author at the beginning. We have the title of that journal article in quotation marks. The journal title is, maybe normally you might think I should underline that, but we're going to italicize it. There's no period after the journal title. That 13.1 that you see there is volume 13, issue 1, and MLA just wants us to do it as 13.1 if there were 13 volumes in the first issue. So we don't have the vol period 13, comma, issue 1. Again, they're trying to condense it a little bit, so when you see 13.1, you're supposed to know that that's volume 13, issue 1. The next part that I put in parentheses is actually extra information. We can actually stop with 13.1 and then do a colon after it, and then the page numbers, 15 to 26. But occasionally people want to try to give people more of a sense of when this was published, because 13.1 doesn't really tell you much in terms of whether it was 100 years ago or 10 years ago or last year. So So people will oftentimes put this extra information about volume 13, issue 1, in parentheses. So I did it as summer because a lot of times journals are spring, summer, fall, and winter, but sometimes they're by month. So you could do May 2012. So we close up that extra information. The colon is the end of all that journal information, and what follows the colon is are the page numbers, so 15 to 26. And normally, with most, if you found it hard copy, you'd probably stop right there with your works cited entry. But because most of us are finding these sources online, we have to indicate that we found it online. So that's what follows next. Online, period, and then the name of the database. I put Academic Search Complete, period. The URL, sometimes people put that in. You don't necessarily have to, because sometimes the URL is about as long as your arm. But then the date that follows that, I put today's date in there, is the date that you last accessed that source. So we have 2 dates in there. We have the summer 2012, and we have today's date, when I last accessed it. People might even sometimes put last accessed right before that date. MLA likes to use this date format that eliminates the comma. So instead of June 18th, comma, 2014, they do 18 June 2014. So basically, I think that kind of covers most of the parameters of the sources that you're working with. There are a lot of pages in our text talking about MLA style, so consult with those. But if you can keep that first line in mind, author, title, and publication information, you should be good. Okay, let me jump up a little bit and talk again about this book thing where I've got all the authors, then everyone's an author. Occasionally, the book that you're looking at is part of a larger work. So books can be part of larger works too. So it might be volume 1 of a series, or it might say part of the Timothy Ray series on composition studies or something. So we've actually got some extra information that's pertinent, but we want to figure out where do we put it. Where you should put it is actually between the title and the publication information. So up there at the top where I've got author, title, publication information, you could say author, title, extra information, and then publication information. So that's a convenient place to put it, is right between the title and the rest of the publication information. So keep that in mind. Okay, let me move on to another special situation that we often deal with. Websites. Okay, so this gets a little tricky. Websites may or may not have authors on them. So what do we do if there is no author? Occasionally I'll see people try to put in anonymous there, but actually what MLA says to do is even for books as well as for websites, if there is no author, just skip over the author and go straight to the title. So we would do the title of the website and then this publication information. So let's take an example of that. The title of the website, let's say it's Lehman College homepage or something like that. And if you look at the Lehman College homepage, there actually isn't a title on there. So you may or may not want to surround that with quotation marks. The date of last update. Oftentimes it's hard to find. So look at the bottom of the web page, and there might be some update information there. It might be exactly by date. It might say 18 June 2014, or it might just say June 2014 or 2014. So whatever type of date information you can find on the page, put that in there. The URL, if I didn't mention it already, URL is the web address, stands for Uniform Resource Locator. And I think on the previous example, I forgot to put these angle brackets around it. But the angle brackets are to indicate that we're only looking at what's within the angle brackets, because we put a period after it. And so we're trying to let people know that the period is not part of the web address. And then date of last access is the date that you last accessed that website, because things are always changing on the web. The information could change that you cited. Someone may go back and edit it later, and someone may look at it later and say, hey, I thought you said, took this direct quote off the website. I can't find it. Probably the website has been updated since then. The website may have simply disappeared. So we put that date of last access to show that we were diligent. We tried to document the information that we needed to document. Okay, finally, where to find some of this information. I'm thinking primarily in terms of books at this point. The title page of a book is where you can find the author, the title, obviously, and the city of publication and the publisher. So again, you might see multiple cities of publication. Just go with the first one. And what about the year of publication, the copyright, so to speak? Turn the page, look at the back of the title page. You'll see a bunch of information, but you should see the copyright year there. Okay, so I think that about covers it for my introductory lecture on MLA Citation Style. Don't want to give you too much at once. Thought this was a good enough chunk for you for now. And good luck. Do the best job you can and work our way toward the final draft. We'll tighten up some of our practices in working with MLA citation and working with sources in general.